English step by step. Phrasal verbs with into, step 1. Let's have a look at some examples. So let's look at 10 common phrasal verbs with into. Now you can see I've put example sentences so you can see context for these phrasal verbs. Often it's difficult to understand the meaning of a phrasal verb looking at the individual words. So it's better to have a sentence to give you a context, and then you can often guess the meaning of the phrasal verb from the context. Let's look at number 1. Look into. The police looked into the situation. Now that means they looked at all the details, they looked at all the information, they looked at all the facts. In other words, the word into suggests deeper looking, deeper investigation. So you could say the police investigated the situation, or they looked into the situation. Number 2, turn into. A small problem turned into a serious problem. Now that means it changed from one form into another form. You can say a small problem changes form into a serious problem. For example, a national problem can turn into an international problem. Or a small problem with your health can turn into a big problem with your health. So it's usually from one small state into a bigger state. Next one, bump into. Now bump usually means to physically contact something. Two bodies in physical contact, to bump into. Or a car can bump into another car. Now in this context we can see the sentence, I bumped into an old friend in the city centre. Now this is not literally bumped, it means I came into contact with an old friend in the city centre. In other words, I met an old friend by chance. So in this situation, I didn't plan to meet an old friend, it happened by chance, to bump into. Number 4, break into. And you can see the context. The burglars broke into the house. Now that means they went into physically, but they had to break something because it was criminal. In other words, illegally they went into the house. Maybe they broke the window, maybe they broke the door, but they broke into the house. Next one, get into. Now, normally this has the sense of arriving in a place or arriving in a situation. Let's look at the example sentence. We got into London at 8 o'clock. So in this case, it's arriving at a place. You can say, we got into London, or we got into the city centre, or we got into Paris, or we got into the town. So it can also be used with situations. For example, we got into a traffic jam, or we got into a crisis, or we got into a difficult situation. Okay, so let's move on to number 6, settle into. The employee settled into his new job. Now the word settle normally means when you arrive somewhere and you stay there and you begin to feel comfortable there. So settle into has this idea of staying and feeling comfortable, becoming familiar with the place. In this case, it means becoming familiar and feeling comfortable with your new job. You can also say he settled into his new home. Or more generally, he settled into his new situation in life. Number 7, go into. So, physically, this means to enter. But here, in this context, it's metaphorical. The teacher went into the subject in great detail. That means he went deeper and deeper into the subject. He studied it, he researched it. Number 8, be into. Now this is a colloquial kind of phrasal verb. It means that you enjoy something, so you do it a lot. For example, the teenagers were into heavy metal music. You could also say, I am into heavy metal music, or he is into heavy metal music, or they were into heavy metal music. So to be into something means to be very keen on something, to be very interested in something, to be very fond of something, to spend a lot of time doing something. Number 9, change into. Now this is similar to number 2, turn into. In this case, it's more connected to the idea of changing form. For example, the caterpillar changed into a butterfly. You could also say the puppy changed into a dog. Or of course, the baby changed into an adult. So any kind of transformation like this, physical form, you can use changed into. Now, number 10 also has the preposition into, but the form of this phrasal verb is different because you have to have an object and then you have to have a gerund. For example, David talked his wife into having a holiday in Iceland. So you need the object, his wife. He talked to his wife and he persuaded her. She didn't want to have a holiday in Iceland, but he persuaded her. He changed her mind. So if you talk somebody into something, you have to persuade them or convince them that something is a good idea. Another example, you could say, the doctor talked the patient into taking the medicine. If the patient didn't want to take the medicine, but then the doctor changes his mind, then you say, talking into. So those are the meanings of the phrasal verbs. So now let's do a matching exercise to check your understanding. So here's the matching exercise. Now you can check your understanding of these phrasal verbs. You can see at the bottom I put words that you could use as alternatives to the phrasal verbs. Of course, the meanings of the phrasal verbs often depends on the context, but these are words that are possible for these sentences. For example, which phrasal verb means enter illegally? Which phrasal verb means get used to? Which phrasal verb means persuade, etc., etc. So you can pause the video now, try to do the matching exercise, and then when you've finished, you can come back and we'll check the answers. So let's go through the answers. Number 1, the police looked into the situation. Well, instead of looked into, you could say investigated the situation. Number 2, a small problem turned into a serious problem. Became a serious problem. Now, as I mentioned before, number 2 and number 9 are often used interchangeably, so you could also say transformed into a serious problem. Number 3, I bumped into an old friend in the city centre. Well, in this case, if you bump into someone, you meet by chance. So you could say, I met an old friend by chance in the city centre. Number 4, the burglars broke into the house. Well, in this case, they entered the house illegally, by force. Number 5, we got into London at 8 o'clock. Well, in this case, you can say, we arrived in London at 8 o'clock. Number 6, settle into. The employee settled into his new job. Well, in this case, we could say he got used to his new job. As I mentioned before, you could say he became familiar with his new job, or he became comfortable with his new job. So, he got used to his new job, he settled into his new job. Number 7, the teacher went into the subject in great detail. Well, in this case, he studied the subject in great detail. He researched the job in the subject in great detail. Number 8, the teenagers were into heavy metal music. Well, they spent a lot of time listening to heavy metal music because they enjoyed it very much. Number 9, the caterpillar changed into a butterfly. Well, there's a transformation, so we could say the caterpillar transformed into a butterfly. And the last one, David talked his wife into having a holiday in Iceland. Well, in this case, he talked to her so that he could persuade her. So he persuaded his wife into having a holiday in Iceland. So there you have possible ways to use other words instead of the phrasal verbs. So we've talked about the meaning of the phrasal verbs, and now we can think a little bit about the form of these phrasal verbs. Now, before we look at the form, you might want to have a look at another video I made about the structure of phrasal verbs. The video is called What is a Phrasal Verb? And you can find it in the link above. So it has 6 points, and most of them are about the objects of phrasal verbs. Some phrasal verbs have an object, some phrasal verbs don't have an object. And some phrasal verbs can be separated, and some phrasal verbs can't be separated. So make sure you watch that video so that you see examples with explanations about these different structures of the phrasal verbs. You can also find the link for this video in the details below. So, as I mentioned, some phrasal verbs have an object and some phrasal verbs don't have an object. Now, with all of these phrasal verbs and all phrasal verbs with into, there is always an object. That's because into is a preposition. So, that means all of these phrasal verbs are transitive. And none of these phrasal verbs can be separated. So, phrasal verbs with into are all of the same type. So that brings us to the end of this Step 1 video on phrasal verbs with into. Now you can move on to the Step 2 video where you'll find a practice exercise so you can check your understanding. If you like the content of this video, please click like and subscribe, and you can request a lesson in the comments below.